So it's always interesting to me to go back and say, okay, the director or the entire staff had to decide how are we going to film this particular segment. Are we going to use 16 millimeter because we want a certain feel, or are we going to use something that's larger because we want more clarity? It's just amazing the number of decisions that you have to make, and film gauge is just one of those.
Hello, and welcome to the Cup of Tea Critiques podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Chasen, and like always, I'll be joined today by the great team that brings you cupofteacritiques.com. We are super excited to get started on our podcast where we will share our unique perspectives on several different areas in movies and television. At Cup of Tea Critiques, we encourage critical viewing of cinematic presentations so you can decide for yourself if they're your cup of tea. Here on the Cup of Tea Critiques podcast, we will dive even deeper into the productions and subjects that we cover on our website, engaging in conversation and sharing our unique perspectives on each topic. Ready for a deep look with a deep brew? This week's topic, shot on film or shot on digital? A rundown of the different options and how they influence the viewing experience. I'm so looking forward to getting to this topic. So without further ado, let's get started. In case you're unaware, Cup of Tea Critiques is a family business, and I'm so happy to introduce my family to you. I'm here with my brother Chris, my mother Reba, and my father Terry. Chris, you're going to have to help us out here because when we were in our meetings previously discussing the film experience, you brought up film gauges, and that's how we ended up on today's topic. So, can you, for all of our listeners out there, just help define film gauge so that they can understand it the way we now do?
Well, a film gauge is just the width of a film strip measured in millimeters. Um, and it goes from a certain range, starting down at 8 millimeter, all the way up to 70 millimeter, and those can heavily influence the viewing experience based on how the picture looks.
It's interesting. The more I learn about filmmaking, the more I'm amazed at all of the details that go into creating a film. And there are a huge number of topics, some of the topics that we've covered and will cover in the future. But this is just another one of those things where when someone is deciding to create a film, um, and some films are actually shot with a mix of um, film gauges just to convey that particular feel for that particular film gauge. So it's always interesting to me to go back and say, okay, the director or the entire staff had to decide how are we going to film this particular segment. Are we going to use 16 millimeter because we want a certain feel, or are we going to use something that's larger because we want more clarity? It's just amazing the number of decisions that you have to make, and film gauge is just one of those.
Yeah, to add to your point, it was very interesting as we learned on this topic. It made more sense why through certain pieces you'll see different effects, and you can, now that we've learned a little bit more on this topic, I can tell like, oh, they filmed that differently than they did the others, not just based on angles or something that they did in post production, but they really started that at the beginning when they filmed it completely on a different size film gauge. So that was pretty cool to learn. Um, Chris, you actually can you give us some examples to help people understand a bit better about what the different sizes mean and maybe some correlation between those productions?
Yeah, so the 8 millimeter, you probably don't see it much unless you're kind of a fan of some older stuff. I mean, it's often used for like home video kind of feel, like it's a more, you're creating a more kind of nostalgic effect. So you might see it in movies that have something to do with somebody harkening back to their childhood, or coming of age type story. Um, some of the most popular movies shot on 8 millimeter, which I'm ashamed to say I've seen none of, are Polish Vampire in Burbank, Ozone, Attack of the Red Mutants, Year of the Horse, and Mary Jane's Not a Virgin Anymore. So as you might as you might guess. Mary Jane's not a virgin anymore certainly sounds coming of age to me. Year of the Horse is actually a documentary about Neil Young's band. So I could also see it. I could also see a documentary filmmaker on a limited budget using, the most inexpensive film stock that they could find. Which, for anyone wondering, 8 millimeter is much cheaper than than 70 millimeter. Um, so those are some of the 8 millimeter brands, and of course there's also Super 8, which is shot with removing perforations on one side so they can get more of the picture onto the strip. Um, and same, there's also Super 16. So moving on to 16 millimeter is it's a grainy, kind of a little bit dirty look to it. And it can be used for kind of more gritty dramas. The biggest filmmaker that's kind of associated with 16 millimeter is Darren Aronofsky, who did Black Swan, who did Pi, who did Requiem for a Dream. His movies tend to be quite downtrodden.
That's nothing to worry about.
Purple in the morning, blue in the afternoon, orange in the evening.
They're very dark. They're generally have very downer endings, um, and so it kind of makes sense to have, a grainier and kind of
Yeah.
dirtier look, because
Hmm.
the characters we're watching on film are going through a lot. um,
Yeah.
and so there's another film, for example, that was shot on 16 millimeter. It was Fruitvale Station. Um,
Oh,
Hmm.
yeah.
so it's another gritty drama, kind of a downer subject. But it is also used, on certain occasions to create a warmer feel for movies such as Moonrise Kingdom, by Wes Anderson. So it can be used to different effects. But those are some of the biggest examples, um, of the 16 millimeter films. 35 millimeter is take your pick. It's most common. It's the kind of catch all. It's denser and deeper, and it's a little more versatile. So you can blow it up. You can shrink it a little bit. Um, but there's tons of. I mean, I can name a few. One for example that came out this year was Challengers, was shot on 35 millimeter. But in all honesty, it's probably the biggest batch of films out there. And if we move on to 65, 70 millimeter, which is very lavish, very big time, big screen productions. Christopher Nolan, pretty much any movie you're watching from Christopher Nolan was probably shot on 65, 70 millimeter, which is projected on the 70 millimeter and shot on 65. Ben Hur, a religious epic, very well known. These big grand chariot races. They wanted to put that on that type of film. So it's just for more grandiose productions like that. And as Dad said, certain movies will mix multiple film stocks together, um, to kind of signify the passing of time. And I think a great example of that was The Fablemans, which came out last year. Steven Spielberg's kind of his coming of age movie of himself, of course. Um, he when he's a kid, he's conveying his love of film and how how his shooting when he was with his friends as a kid has changed over time. He starts in 8 millimeter, he gets to 60 millimeter, he ends up in 35 millimeter. So if you mix different film stocks, you can kind of convey, um, It's certainly a coming of age, or how time is changing. The same was done with Steve Jobs, the movie Steve Jobs, where they kind of mixed different film stocks to convey when he was struggling as a young entrepreneur, all the way to when he was a successful businessman. So uh, very, very, it's interesting. It's there's more thought that goes into it than we would probably think when we're sitting down watching it, and it just goes to show how many creative choices are made in the production of just one film.
Fun to hear about because on this kind of topic, for example, my first idea on like the way things are shot differently came from actually sitting down and watching movies with you, mom and dad, growing up. Because I remember having the full screen effect on there, and you guys would be like, "No, we want the widescreen." And that's the first time I got the idea that things could be shot differently. Because with widescreen, you can actually see the entire scene as opposed to what gets cut off when you're watching something on full screen. Another thing for me that Chris, you're helping me understand, which was kind of a little bit mind blowing, is I'm huge into the IMAX experience, and part of that is because just about any kind of movie that's blowing things up, I end up going to the theater to see, and a lot of those are shot in IMAX.
Yeah.
So I like that full effect where my face is basically blown off by both the action on the screen and the, the volume that can come across. But when you say things to me like Ben Hur was shot with the same kind of film, my mind is blown because I thought of that as being something that was created much more recent. And it turns out, no, Ben Hur wasn't made in 2012. It was made way back when. So it's interesting to know that the film gauges have been expanding over time, and not like it still goes back even further than just recent developments. With that in mind, I kind of wanted to just kind of throw out to the panel and everything. Can you guys tell me some of the like favorite effects you guys like with film?
Sure, I can tell you. Like you, I like IMAX for the experience for a lot of things large and things that are blowing up. But Avatar, I thought was probably the greatest movie experience to that point that I had ever had. I thought I'm usually critical of 3D because a lot of times the effect just looks a little unnatural. Is the best way I can describe it in terms of some of the things like helicopters flying around and that sort of thing. But Avatar was the first 3D experience I had where I really felt immersed in it, and it didn't look artificial. And of course, I did see that on an IMAX.
I can say that as I've learned, I've looked back on some of the films I've watched and begun to think about what gauge these films were shot. Maestro is one big one that comes to mind. Essentially a historical piece about Leonard Bernstein's life that was done by Bradley Cooper.
Oh, well, it's 12.
No.
6.
No.
8.
Can you try? Just
Maybe I should
concentrate.
stop and think for a second.
You should stop and think, because I am sending it to you.
20.
No.
So how long do we have to do this for?
Oh, we need to build up a very strong connection.
And I find it fascinating. The film begins in black and white when Leonard Bernstein was maybe in his late 20s. And it was the film was really grainy. The appearance and feel of the film was quite grainy then. And then it goes through these eras. So I guess the period was around 1940s or so. But by the time you get to present day in the film, it looks like it's clear. It's what you typically see in film, and it's in color and such. And so I got to thinking, I wonder if he used different film gauges in order to give that effect, because he wanted to give that old feel, that kind of nostalgic feel early on in the film to reflect the era, the historical era, when Leonard Bernstein was just beginning his career. And so I'm thinking, I would love to see, I don't know if Bradley Cooper's ever written about his technical decisions around shooting Maestro, but I'm very curious to know, did he use 8 millimeter or likely 16 millimeter to shoot the first part of that film, that to reflect the 40s and 50s, for example. And then he moved on from there to maybe the 35, and then moved on from there to maybe a 65 linearly or something. But that's what I thought about. And to your dad's point, these filmmakers in their pre-production meetings, it must be pretty incredible to be a part of that, because they have to. I never thought about the decision to use film stock as being on their agenda, but indeed it has to be, especially when you're talking about these historical epic pieces.
For me, I think seeing that Darren Aronofsky is insistent on using 16 millimeter, I thought was interesting because um, I always thought his movies can be, like as I said, can be very downtrodden. And so when I saw Requiem for a Dream, I thought, wow, what a great movie that I never want to watch again. Um, I think it's funny to think of the other aspects of the film that contribute to how you feel about it. I mean, the decision to shoot it the way he did, it kind of enhances the subject matter in a way, and I didn't appreciate that when I first saw it years and years ago. So that's what I think back to, and I think on a bigger scale, I think about Twister. I think about natural disaster type movies, which I would have assumed were shot kind of on the biggest film gauge they could get their hands on. It turns out both the original Twister and the one that came out this year were shot on 35, and they were blown up for a bigger picture when they needed to be. But so I think that's interesting. The certain angles, is that a budget choice? Is that a whatever it might be? Um, I think that's an interesting, interesting which films maybe surprise you with what they were shot on.
Chris, I agree with you. Films like Requiem for a Dream, it's great the film that they chose because I felt like it connected me to the subject matter a little bit better. Like I felt more attached to the piece. However, it is one of those where because it's so heavy, and same with 7 pounds, it's not a matter of the movies not being good or anything like that. It's that they made us feel almost too much. And that's a testament though to how well they were put together, in part because of the film stock they chose to use. People that are listening are going to hear us talking about film and they're going to think, well, what about today's age where everything is digital? And so like, can we, why don't we just go ahead and spend some time just speaking on the differences between film and digital and how they both are connected, but also how one is affected by the cost of the other.
Right. So all the stuff we just said applies to about 10% of movies made today. Um, a lot of movies now are shot on digital cameras, um, which kind of it's basically just bringing things into to the modern age. Essentially, it helps filmmakers, I guess, save on the cost of film strips of film stock. And so what in researching, we found that as recently as 2017, over 80% of films are shot on digital, um, and about close to 10% were shot on both digital and film, which leaves you very little actually being shot on strictly film. And that's there's a fallout from that, in terms of how it's processed, how it's distributed, and it's a cost saver for some and not so much for others. So we'll be getting into that shortly.
So when we say that only 10% or 20% of films are produced on film stock, is that number tiny because it's being influenced so much by Hulu and Netflix and the other streaming channels? I just wonder about that.
Yeah, I think that's part of the evolution too. I mean, I
Yeah,
think
that's fair.
that's part of, and I think it's very intentional, which we could also get into shortly here. But yeah, I think yeah, that's definitely part of it. Home entertainment has increased tenfold and then some.
Mhm.
Specifically in recent years with the with the popularity of subscription services. And
Right.
so yeah, a lot more stuff is either bypassing theatrical release or having as temporary a theatrical release as you could possibly imagine, or very limited release. And that could certainly be one of the reasons. Well, it is one of the reasons, but
Okay.
even most of the stuff in theaters, I think, is still shot on digital. I think in 2023, what they said was, over, this year was there was an uptick. It was like 60 or so films were shot on film. That's not a ton.
It's like a
So
handful compared to the
yeah,
Okay.
total number of
Okay.
smaller
Okay.
productions.
releases. Yeah, so I would actually still say most of this, even most of the stuff in theaters, is still being shot on digital. I think the distinction is, and I think the films that the films that get shot on film are, I think, a lot from either maybe the occasional independent films. I mean, a lot of these are A24, Searchlight, um, Focus
Okay.
Features. So there's some independent productions that they'll shoot on film, and there's also some very big name directors who insist on shooting on film, like Aronofsky, like Christopher
Hmm.
Nolan, like Quentin Tarantino. The Hateful Eight, for instance, was shot on, I believe it was 65. But they insist, on shooting on film, because they can get that done.
Exactly.
Other filmmakers are like, must be nice, jerk. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
they I gotta shoot on digital. It's the only way I'm gonna get this done, Quentin. Um, so yeah, I still think it's a pretty small percentage that are even of the theatrical releases that are being shot on film.
Chris, you brought up a couple of things, and I had two different directions I wanted to take this, but I want to kick this to Dad first because as I'm listening and I'm hearing about Christopher Nolan's way of doing it, Quentin Tarantino's way of doing it, like to Chris's point, it must be nice that you can afford to do those kinds of things. But I wonder to a certain extent if that is part of the reason why we really enjoy the films that we see by them is because they were shot on that traditional film gauge and then converted over to digital. Dad, do you feel any kind of similarity to that thought?
I mean, until we started talking about this, I really never looked at a film in that way at all. It kind of it gave the impression that it gave, but now, as your mother said, looking back at films, I can go, I wonder. um, they actually obviously made a conscious decision to film it in this way and to use a certain type of film gauge. But yeah, generally speaking, I've always kind of just absorbed the film for what it was, never really thinking about the technical things behind um, how they made it and the decisions they made to intentionally use certain types of film in order to give you a certain feel.
It's funny you say that because we talked about the fact that it's changed our entire experience when it comes to how we watch our productions, including sticking around with the credits to get some of those details in the back. I'm wondering if they shot it in
Yes.
this film or this way or whatever. And so literally the credits have taken on a new meaning for us because we're getting even more information or
Yeah.
Yeah.
confirming our
Right.
perspectives. Be with what you said, that there is something to the way they use these gauges to help us feel emotionally and connect to the pieces that we are watching. So, like,
Yeah.
can you kind of give
Yeah.
more on that, like your take on it?
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you 100% because as I watched, I really liked Maestro. It was a long movie, about 2.5 hours or so. It spanned the life of Leonard Bernstein. And initially, when I started watching it, it felt like a 16 millimeter type, but I understand why he did that. Um, but I didn't understand that until the film began to progress and the look and feel, the appearance of the movie changed. The time period changed. And so I understood exactly what he was doing. He was putting the audience, he was putting me there with them. He was like, "Now, this is where I am now. Come with me." I was very drawn in to this film. It wasn't just the acting, it wasn't just the music. It was that I felt right there with them. The countryside felt like the early 60s, and it was just right there with them. So I just thought an effective use of film stock to bring me to that historical era. And that's why I asked the question earlier on the degree to which the film stock should be used to reflect the era of the story. That is something we lose with digital. If we go all digital, and to Chris's point, only 20% of films now are done with film stock. And because it's so expensive, only those who have the budget for it can do it, which means, you wonder, even for some of those historical pieces, would they have been stronger pieces had they been done with film stock?
Well, that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, though, in terms of digital. Can you
Yeah,
create all the various fields of film gauges with digital? Can
yeah,
you give the feel of an 8 millimeter, 16 millimeter, 35 millimeter, anamorphic, whatever? Can you do that when you're doing film on digital?
yeah.
Is it as simple as pushing a button or clicking a preset though? I mean, to what degree can you replicate it? I think is the. I'm sure there's ways to do it. I'm just. Is it the same?
It won't necessarily be the same. It's kind of like, and it's probably very subtle to some extent, like vinyl versus a CD. I
Mhm.
mean, you could have vinyl and you get that authentic sound from vinyl, or you can have a CD to which you could probably record in some crackles and pops
No, no,
to give you
no,
the
no,
same
no.
feel.
Those are
But
different.
they are. But my point is that I would imagine that um, I don't know what the state of the art is now with digital, but if it isn't a part of it now, it definitely is something that
Yeah.
they're working on and it will evolve to the state where they can do that, to your point, at the push of a button, in terms of I want this feel, 16 millimeter feel. I want the 35 millimeter anamorphic look.
Yeah.
Yeah, to both of those points, I think that currently they have a button that they can press that they think is executing this well. But I'm going to draw a couple of parallels right quick. Number one, there are holiday albums that we listen to, and when it's vinyl, it just gives so much more of that warm holiday feel for me versus the digitized CD that I can now
Mm-hmm.
listen to of these same productions. And I
Mm-hmm.
could put that in and it's nice, or even if I have it digitally on like my phone or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
it's nice that they're clear, but they don't feel as warm as when I listen to
Yeah.
that vinyl and get to actually enjoy the holiday times with that. So I liken that to this conversation here where I think that there's a recent. I'm gonna be nice and not mention the name of this film. I have a lot of issues with it, but one of them, it's a recent action film that came out. We'll say in the last calendar year. That I absolutely believe that when they did the flashback scenes, they pressed a button and told me to feel a certain type of way, and they failed miserably. And I think it would have been way better executed had those scenes been filmed using actual film to give that sense. And I feel like when I look at certain other movies, they are purposefully done using older film or different gauged film to give me that sensation that I'm back in that time period or that I am looking back in history. It's a flashback scene of somebody's life, and doing using the film gives me the actual feeling like it's almost a fuzzy memory of my own. I'm present within the film, I'm present
Mm-hmm.
within that moment,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm actually have enjoying this look back in
Yeah.
my mind similar to the characters they're trying to portray. And same thing with movies like I believe we talked about this with Jobs, where they will film different time periods of that movie with different film to give us the sensation of this occurred during this time frame. It has now
Mm-hmm.
progressed into this stage in his life, which is moving forward from his childhood or from his youth days to then where he ultimately ended up at the end of his life, where he had become such a success. And you can see that much more clearly. So, film, I think, can still express that better than a digital button to try and tell me to feel a certain way. To Dad's point, at some point they might master that, but currently they are not there.
Yeah.
Well, I also and I agree with that to some degree. I also think this goes back to so many conversations surrounding producing anything, but specifically in film. It's just like there's the ideal method or the ideal process, and then there's reality. Like we might not shooting it on film just may not be a reality for certain. It may not. It just may not be. If we're insistent that we do it exactly like this, A, B, C, it might just not get made. So I think um, I think it's there's an element of compromise in so many
Okay.
different aspects for and I'm not just talking about shooting what you shoot on, just you know
Fair.
how many actors are in it, how many sets can we use, how many settings, how expansive can this story be. I mean the kind of joke I always make with some of my friends who shoot stuff it's just like somebody comes to them with a script and they're like, I got this great idea for this short film that takes place in an airplane, and it's like, all right, well, do you have an airplane? Like it's there's I even though I agree that there's an authenticity to the way we used to do anything, listen to music, um shoot movies, etc. And maybe something's lost when we bring it into the new age. I think about to go to take it further. I mean, we used to give each other CDs as Christmas gifts, right? And it felt good when you nailed that person's taste, or it's like, I knew you wanted that CD. Well, now if you give somebody a CD, it's like, thanks, I already have every CD this artist came out with, but thanks for this CD. Right? Like that's just something we lost. But so I think there's a little bit of there's compromise in it, I guess is all I'm saying, is that sometimes it's just not a reality that we get to do things the old way.
It's
Yeah, I agree, Chris, no doubt. No doubt. But it doesn't change what we want. It doesn't change. It doesn't change our desire for authenticity.
It could be a prompt to kind of dive deeper into this in terms of what are all these elements of photography. Photography is I'm using photography and cinematography
Yeah.
interchangeably, but it's very complicated, and I was never drawn to it, when I was in film school. Um, but learning all the different aspects of it, I think it could be interesting. I just think reading about it in a and learning about it in a broad sense, and then telling the industry how they're failing is kind of um, I don't know. It's maybe presumptuous, I guess. I don't know.
another thing I wanted to touch on, Chris. We're talking about digital versus film, and a lot of our audience members are going to probably think, at least to a certain extent, well, I'm saving a ton of money because I can actually do all of this stuff from my phone. So, can you speak some to that kind of feeling? In this new technological age, we're actually able to put together some pretty good productions without having to deal with any of the equipment and costs, like what we're kind of discussing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's I mean, the device you're recording on, the places you could post it are opening up a lot of doors for people who don't have those resources. If you could shoot on your phone, put it on your YouTube page, you can get somebody could see it, or you can, as we talked about in a previous episode, at least get a proof of concept out there that you could show to somebody. And it's not going to be perfect, but it's a lot more perfect than air. So there's just a
Yeah.
lot of I mean, even and that can pay off for even bigger filmmakers. I mean, Sean Baker, who did Adnora this year and the Florida Project previously, he towards the end of the Florida Project was shooting on an iPhone.
I can't say it.
And this is a pretty popular movie that was shot partially
Mhm.
on an iPhone. As we found out, some of that was due to budgetary restrictions. It worked out because I think he used it in the best way he knew how. But but to your point, I mean, it can bridge the gap for a lot of people that, on whatever scale.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about bigger productions and everything, but something as small as say like home movies. So like mom and dad used to film some of our events off of the old school camcorders, but you had to actually have film for that. And then nowadays, it's not uncommon to be at your kid's performance or something like that and see about 100 phones go up to record, and the quality is just
Yeah,
so
right.
nice. I, I admit I will look back on some of those things you guys have recorded. We've converted them onto DVD and such, so there's a little digital aspect to it. But I've watched those, and then I've watched performances of my child and seeing a difference in the quality. Not that that takes away from the experience, but it reminds me of just how far we've come from film to now things being on digital.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and for the record, the digital does cost more at the beginning acquisition because that phone cost more than the camcorder did in the past. I know that.
Well, you
Not that
could
it was a
pay.
cheap purchase for the time, but it's certainly a big
Yeah, but you could
investment.
pay. You could pay $12 a month for 85 years and get the phone paid off. So that's
True, they've come up with better payment plans nowadays, but it still costs so much more in the long run. And we say that kind of in jest, but it really is true that the acquisition cost is actually so much more. And that's kind of where I want to take this next is due to this digital age, we're finding that that cost really is high. And that is kind of getting passed on to the consumer, if not by accident, Chris. We were talking about this earlier, Chris, mom, and dad, whoever wants to jump in first, but just how, because of the new digital age, that is affecting the actual cinematic experience. What do you guys want to say to that?
um, yeah, we were reading an article that Chris had given us relating how digital converters are costing upwards of around $100,000, which is a steep cost for some small indie theaters. When you think about going digital for distribution, it's quite cheap, a lot cheaper for studios to distribute hard drives at about $125 each versus the film, which is, I think we said about 2,000 per. So that's a huge reduction in cost for them to do the distribution. But in order for smaller theaters to be able to use that content, it's somewhat of a prohibitive price for them. So they've gone through various ways of trying to raise money to be able to move into the digital age, but it does affect some of the smaller shops. I know we used to appreciate going to some of the smaller theaters in our neighborhood just because they had really good popcorn for starters. And it was a nice experience.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with your dad. It's difficult for small businesses, these small kind of neighborhood independent theaters to shoulder that kind of cost, $100,000 for a, a a digital converter so that they can show these films. So what's the irony here is it's a lot easier for filmmakers. It's a lot easier for filmmakers to make, yeah, especially young filmmakers to make their films, but it's very difficult for independent theaters to show them because of the cost. And as a result, um, a number of these theaters have closed because they simply can't shoulder that. Um, and that is indeed unfortunate. Initially, though, when a lot of these films were made, were beginning to be made on digital, these studios did provide a subsidy to the independent theaters to help shoulder the cost. Uh, Unfortunately, those were temporary subsidies. Um, so it was inevitable that many of these theaters would not be able to hold up to that. I wish I had the numbers in front of me for the number of theaters that have had to close, but it's no surprise, I guess, that we've seen kind of a growth in these huge cinemas.
Yeah. So yeah, the The digital projectors now cost like $100,000, and a film projector is not even, I don't think, even 10% of that. And if you think about it, the independent film theaters already have a film projector, so it's
Yeah.
essentially you're taking something that they already had and replacing it with something that's 10 times or more of the cost of what that original piece of equipment was. Um, what small business is going to be able to sustain after something like that? Unless M&Ms are suddenly a grand, a
Exactly.
grand a bag. So yeah, so I think it definitely hurt a lot of smaller theater chains, or just independent theaters. Um, and that was not, I don't think that was the purpose of it necessarily, but I think the point was um, the slow progression towards cutting theaters out of the picture, because a lot of these productions, or a lot of these production companies, they're going to make their money back on home entertainment, because
Hmm.
they don't have to, they don't necessarily have to split the profit with the theaters themselves the same way. So
Interesting.
um so yeah, I mean, that was one step in this kind of gradual process, and that was starting a decade ago. So
Hmm.
maybe longer. So yeah, so it's kind of a, you give it and you take it away, right? Like, certain filmmakers now can make a film. If you don't have a big budget, you can make it for less and less of a hassle. But and on the backside of it is, certain businesses, they go away. And so I think that's the unfortunate side of it, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's an experience that you look forward to when you go to local theater, being able to see your neighbors there, and knowing the people that work there. And there's that experience you look forward to. And you just, it's not that there isn't something great about being able to watch content in the comfort of your own home. But if your only option is to go to a cinema or to stay home, that's unfortunate that there's nothing in between. So yeah, there's certainly something lost there, which I'll plug this. Interestingly, you wrote about this, Chris, about two and a half years ago or so, when you talked about um, how cinemas are becoming so, how many people go to theaters much anymore, and it's partly a result of these cinemas that have been built up that have bars in them now, where people can actually go and sit and have drinks, etc. You don't have these just neighborhood theaters that you go to for the popcorn that Terry
Yeah.
likes, or the M&Ms that used to be 50 cents.
Yeah. Right.
And yeah, and just get that kind of old neighborhood feel. So yeah, it was a really good article. Very really good point.
Yeah, and I think that's where we can leave this one right now, because just making sure everybody understands that what kind of effect this is having on us that we didn't even though we're enjoying the film going experience, it does come with a cost. With that, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up for this edition of the Cup of Tea Critiques podcast. We hope you enjoyed listening as much as we enjoyed sharing today's conversation. Honestly, we could go on just like every other time, but we do look forward to you joining us again next week for another great discussion. You can stay in the loop on all things COTC by subscribing on our website at cupofteacritiques.com. You can also find us on Facebook, check out our Instagram at Cup of Tea Critiques, and on Letterboxd at COT Critiques. For Reba, Terry, and Chris, I'm Brandon. We'll see you next time for another deep look with a deep brew.